Right, here we go, everybody. So we were working on, of course, tafsir, Surah An-Nisa, and in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, first of all, tafsir Surah An-Nisa, and we actually left off right here. إنا أنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق لتحكم بين الناس بما أراك الله. And of course, we went in detail, but there was a very important story that I didn't actually mention in this class. So we're going to mention it in this class, even though we mentioned it in another class. But inshallah, we're actually going to be bringing about a number of different explanations in regarding to this story. Now, of course, the previous parts of the ayat were actually speaking about prayer, speaking about the munafiqeen, and so forth. But then here's a little shift, and this is actually common in the Quran to actually shift into a new topic, into a new issue, into laying out, let's say, another segment for the bigger uh, prelude that the surah started out with. So remember, the surah starts out with speaking about the connection, the dynamics of and the structure of justice, the dynamic of family structure, and the foundations of what makes justice. And it talks about money, it talks about inheritance, and then we go into certain details about another group that might actually obstruct the application of justice, the munafiqeen, and of course, the people of the book. And then we speak about certain things, certain methods that the munafiqeen might use to obstruct justice, to obstruct truth, to obstruct, of course, the application. And that's where that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lays out what it actually means to, one, embrace justice, understand it, and apply it. At the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you the different groups of different groups that do have the different groups that do actually have different intentions. One, it could be for personal reasons, for personal interest. Two, it could be for, of course, another interest, which is for, let's call it, their own group interest. So you might have one group that wants their group, or at least their idea, their ideology, to come forward. So they'll advance their own groups, they'll advance or at least support their own groups, they'll give the different political support, economical support, and certainly agendas in order to make their ideas be superior to Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was, remember the prelude for the surah, in where it's making a Muslim body. The body starts at home, the body starts within the masjid, the body starts within our mind and our hearts, actually being fixated that justice is to be defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that truth is actually revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not by speculation, it is not by hawa or by desire, it is by الوحي. It is by revelation. Where did we get this idea from? We got it يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى. Remember the epistemology, the foundation of what we learn, what we know. Everything that you know is either going to be based on speculation, in other words, ideas that you might think that it's all about you understanding the consequences, or maximizing the good, or whatever it is. Or you might think of it as that way, or it's really just your whims, or the society in a certain group of people pushing forward towards a certain whim, towards a certain pleasure. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. And verily, they received the guidance. Verily, they received the revelation. In other words, this is the basis of making one, a sound, just a sound statement, two, making the definition of for the foundation of what justice really is. So this is not to say that, oh, we shouldn't study, we shouldn't do math, etc. This is not necessarily what we're referring to in terms of speculation. When we say يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى, we're speaking about the definition of justice. We're speaking about understanding the truth behind the world. All right. This is not saying you can't study math, you can't study science, but this is actually talking about what makes truth, what makes what makes facts, what makes something as considered as the basis of knowledge. Okay. What makes the basis of knowledge? What makes the basis of knowledge is not experiment. Experiment is a tool. And your own senses, your own feelings, those are not necessarily the foundation of knowledge, but that's a tool. What is the foundation of knowledge? وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَّبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. And their Lord Almighty, your Lord Almighty had sent you the guidance in order to help you identify the different ununderstood, or at least the different definitions that surround you in understanding ethics, understanding the purpose that preceded your existence, and understanding certainly where you're heading to in this life, the aftermath of life, after death. What is the purpose that preceded my existence that I'm heading to in this life? And certainly, what is the principle that I should be adopting and embracing in order for me to connect and relate to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created me for? In other words, what maximizes the good interest, the good human interest, and even, let's call it even the interest within nature. What is, of course, nature doesn't have an interest, but let's talk about how we would connect. In other words, how we would also reflect what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created in nature that maximizes the good for us. In other words, at the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ. There, all that premise and all that prelude that I had done just right now is really to get to this point in where, yes, the Quran was giving us all these different areas of what makes our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our bond with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stronger. Yes, Quran, yes, Salah, yes, understanding justice. So then the ayah emphasizes, well, speaking of which, and certainly you're going to find and you're going to come across a lot of opposition that is trying to take you away from the religion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then emphasizes, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهُ وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا. We had revealed unto you the book with truth in order to judge between people with what the Lord Almighty had inspired you with, and do not be a supporter for those that had betrayed themselves. Now, a number of different things to mention here is that there's actually a story. What is and why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell the Prophet ﷺ not to support those that would betray themselves? Was the Prophet ﷺ attempting to support anybody that was actually betraying themselves? So this ayah was actually revealed because of a story. Let's look at the story. Bani Ubayriq, the word Bani actually means the children of. So this is speaking about a certain tribe. A certain tribe, they had three brothers, Bishr, Bushair, and Mubashir. Their cousin was Usayr ibn Urwa. Now, Bishr, Ushair, and Mubashir, they basically went throughout the night and they had heard that a guy named Rifa'a ibn Zayd, there was a caravan coming from Syria. The caravan carried with them semolina or wheat, and of course, they basically had heard that, oh, we know who purchased these valuable items, so therefore we can find and seize the right time to basically steal it. So Bishr, Bushair, Mubashir, and even Usaid, they basically make a plan to go for Rifa'a ibn Zayd's house and actually steal not only the food and the goods that he had bought, but including other items. So they basically steal that. Well, of course, when you're dealing with semolina, you're basically going to end up pretty much leaving different traces of that. So it was found, but they had this dispute who really actually stole the items. And of course, you look at Usair, he wanted to defend Bishr, Bishr, Bushair, and Mubashir. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ, Rifa'a ibn Zayd, along with his nephew Qatada ibn Nu'man. They basically went to the Prophet ﷺ and basically told the Prophet ﷺ that, well, they found the perpetrators, and those were Bishr, Bushair, and Mubashir. How did you know? Well, we found the little tiny pieces from our own semolina or wheat actually tracing the way to their home. In other words, the items were actually, ironically, who would do that, but that's what he did. So he that is Rifa'a, he actually put his valuables inside the semolina. So when they basically took the semolina and even took the valuables that are inside the semolina, that traces them. Little tiny things are dropping from the semolina and it's leading all the way to their home. So Rifa'a ibn Zayd and even his nephew Qatada, they went to the Prophet ﷺ, who comes in advocating for Bishr, Bushair, and Mubashir. The one to advocate for them was Usair ibn Urwa, who it was really their cousin. He came in to advocate, and he came in telling the Prophet ﷺ, O Prophet of Allah, they were actually accusing this family that is actually a pious and a good family of religiosity, of good reputation, and they're ruining the reputation of these wonderful men. How dare they? And the Prophet ﷺ actually fell for it. What happened? Well, the Prophet ﷺ, he basically starts getting angry at who? At Rifa'a and at Qatada. And he tells them, well, you didn't have any evidence. You don't have any evidence to prove the assault, to prove that Bishr, Mubashir, and Bushair, that they actually had committed such an assault. So therefore, I will not accept your claim. That's when the ayah was revealed, actually bringing in the truth. When the Prophet ﷺ had been on the brink of actually judging, not based on, of course, the truth necessarily, the reality of the situation of what he didn't know. He was judging based on his side, the human side, and of course, it's all human side, but he was basically hearing the whole story, and based on what he had heard, he basically thought, well, I mean, looking at the evidence, I don't see any evidence for you to accuse these people of actually committing such an assault. Therefore, you don't have the right to basically accuse them, and therefore, we cannot prove and ask them to return your items because you don't have any evidence to prove that they have it. That's when the ayah was revealed. وَلَا تُجَادِلْ عَنِ الَّذِينَ يَخْتَانُونَ أَنفُسَهُم. So there it is. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right there bringing in the truth, even when the Prophet ﷺ had thought he was doing the right thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was actually sending the wahi in order to continue with the whole idea that the Prophet ﷺ is actually infallible. So even when the Prophet ﷺ is on the brink of making a mistake, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send the wahi to correct and make sure that he is not supporting whatsoever crime. That's why the Prophet ﷺ is Masum. So this actually keeps the Prophet ﷺ into the isma, or into being infallible, because whenever the Prophet ﷺ is about to make a mistake, that's when the wahi would come in. Now, the
subhanallah.
exactly,
So that's what, yeah.
So what happened is that this guy Usair, he basically had proposed a name. He's like, well, what I'm proposing is Labid ibn Sahl. Now, of course, or another guy, they basically said, well, there's another Jewish man. That Jewish guy, they proposed a certain name that basically they said it was him, this Jewish guy. He must have some history, and he's the one. They proposed that name. But the Prophet ﷺ, even if the man is a Jew, it doesn't mean that we give ourselves the right to accuse innocent people of an assault that they did not commit. So that's when, of course, these Bani Ubayriq, they basically had, well, at least what the main perpetrator, he basically runs away to Mecca. All right. And when he runs away to Mecca, of course, then the woman that basically had taken him in, that's when Hassan ibn Thabit, I'm not going to read the poem, all right. Hassan ibn Thabit writes a poem talking about the lady that embraced this perpetrator, and then she hears about the poem, that it was really speaking about how dare she would actually embrace a man and actually have relations with him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, when you go against the order of the Prophet ﷺ, you're going to find yourself in a fitna. Well, the lady actually basically kicked him out of her house, but he then goes and runs away to Khaybar. He runs away to Khaybar, and that's where the predominantly a Jewish tribe, and actually left Islam there. And then one day a wall actually falls on him when he had left Islam, and that was his ending. Right? It was just some wall collapsed on him and basically killed him. So at the end of the day, what was the story is that, let's go back to that ayah right there. The story was really the story of Bani Bayriq and Bishr, Mubashir, and what was their names? And they have really nice names, by the way. Let me tell you what their names mean. Bishr, Bushair, and Mubashir. Bishr, glad tidings. It's like Bishr is like the good news coming to you. Bushair is the person that is bringing the good news, and Mubashir is the one that's getting the good news. But certainly they didn't actually bring the best news. So yeah. All right, let's continue. Let's continue with the ayah right there. Let's see. إنا أنزلنا إليك الكتاب الحق لتحكم بين الناس بما أراك الله. In order for the Prophet ﷺ, so I want you to look at here, لتحكم, in where the Quran was revealed with the truth, with the details of justice, the semicolon, let's actually put it right there. So what is the Quran to be used for? Number one, لتحكم بين الناس بما أراك الله. In order for you to judge with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically inspired you with. Right? لتحكم. And where, when we speak about لتحكم, this is right there, and another ayah basically telling us that what the Quran was really revealed for was in order to bring about the right vision, to bring about the right understanding, the definition of justice, the definition of ethics, the morality and what it actually entails and so forth. So when you look at لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهِ, in order to judge between the people. So what about that was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or is that also after the Prophet ﷺ? So when you look at لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهِ, yes, during his life, but that does not mean that after the Prophet ﷺ's death, that becomes history. No, whatever sunnah, whatever information he had left behind, or what we would know about the Prophet ﷺ, whether it's a report of something that he had said, or a report that he had done, or something that he had ruled, or something that was a report of how he basically decided on things, that would all be considered sunnah. Sunnah to mean a reference that we would turn to in order to do the judgment. So therefore, you look at two resources for us to know the resource of haqq. The resource to define truth is number one, al-kitab, al-Quran, and definitely the second one, لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهِ, to judge based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you as an inspiration. Bima arakallah. What does that entail? So that actually entails that there is a written piece, a written tool, or at least a written reference, which is the textual wahi, the textual revelation, which is al-Quran, which is called and referred to here as al-Kitab. And the second revelation is basically the revelation of what the Prophet ﷺ practices, what the Prophet ﷺ had basically been given as a revelation, one, to what he was supposed to do, what he was supposed to basically rule, and certainly bima arakallah, it basically entails that there is a textual wahi, that is al-Quran, and there's an actual practical wahi that was actually implemented and done by the Prophet ﷺ himself. This is really important to keep in mind. There's the textual wahi, i.e., the Quran, and there's the practical wahi, that is the sunnah. Both
What is
are
the root? Sorry, what is the root for? Is it araka?
بما أراك. أراك,
Araka.
right, بما أراك. So أراك, the word أراك actually means what he had made you vision. Okay, that's what it means. What he had
Okay,
vision.
okay.
All right. So in other words, when we're speaking about having a vision, this is not necessarily الرؤية الصادقة, but this vision is really that you see the world, you judge based on, of course, a certain vision. The vision is basically an inspiration. Why did the Prophet ﷺ, for example, do such a thing? Well, he is ma'soom. He is infallible as a prophet. The second he might make a mistake, right instantly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make sure that that mistake is not committed in order to continue with the isma, with the infallibility, because people are supposed to be embracing the prophets as infallible, embracing the prophets as the practical, divine, let's call it that one, the practical, and of course, based on the divine order that the Lord Almighty had given them, that inspiration to stay with a vision that the Lord Almighty had given them, to see the truth as truth and abide by it and implement it, and evil as evil, and to abide by it and stay away from it, or at least abide by seeing that it's evil. All right, and stay away from it. So when we look at bima arakallah, this is why we would make the dua. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. Ya Allah, show us the truth as truth and make us from those that implement it and practice it. And show us what is evil as evil and make us from those that recognize it and stay away from it. So when you look at Bima Arak Allah, yes, we can't be a prophet and actually have this kind of vision, but we can actually relate ourselves and connect with the Quran and Sunnah in order to have our vision in place and to make sure that you're seeing everything in the right vision. Definitely, we're not going to guarantee, and certainly you're not going to get a wahi, but you already have the wahi, was already revealed. So how do I actually get such a vision? طلب العلم. We're not going to tell you that you're going to get a vision per se, you know, an actual vision, but here I'm talking about a metaphorical vision in where you're going to be capable of recognizing right from wrong based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed to us. Bima arak Allah, you've got right there to help you recognize all the different things in order to make sure that what you're applying in life is based on Quran and Sunnah. Okay, my aiding tool is, where is it? My laptop is freezing. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we
Alhamdulillah.
can hear you.
I'm not sure why. Okay, here we go. I got it back. All right. Okay, here we go. So, وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا. I want to take you back because this portion of it right here, when it says وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا, is actually a main thing that the scholars that had went in details. Can we actually learn law and study law and become lawyers? That's a very common question that I would get. And that's where the scholars that had said, you cannot be a lawyer. But here's one thing. When we're speaking about law and studying law, it depends on the type of law. It depends on the type of type of let's say the type of practice you're doing. So if we're doing a practice and where the practice is criminal law, that's when you could possibly be in defense for somebody that is actually a criminal. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that you cannot support al-kha'inin, those that had betrayed others, those that basically are perpetrators. So you're standing right there and using your intelligence and using your power and energy to support those that are actually probably the real perpetrators, the real criminals. All right. So in that situation, if you already know that this person is a criminal, then you cannot be in defense. That's number one. Number two is that, of course, right now, secular governments do not rule by Islam. They do not rule by Islam, not in the laws of punishment, and certainly not in the laws of evidence to prove an assault, or certainly not in the ways to basically even give the rights for the others. So in that situation, of course, using secular law and standing for secular law would actually be something that is haram. And وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا. You cannot support, of course, evil. You cannot support evil, not necessarily, not only about the person himself, but even support the system. So the second that you are supporting the system, you are simply perpetrating the system and basically becoming a tool to support the system itself. Now, there are different types of course, lawyers and what they do. So some might actually be for immigration, others might actually be for family, or others might actually be for the uh, civil laws and all of that stuff. So it depends exactly what the person is actually studying and whether it supports a system that Islam is against or not. So in situations where it is to support a system that is against Islam, then definitely it would be haram to engage in that practice. All right, it would be haram to engage in that practice, because by perpetrating the system, you are actually there contradicting what you basically believe in regards to Islam, and certainly you're then supporting a system that is a kufr and a kafir system, and certainly that would basically be kufr, a form of kufr. And of course, the Prophet ﷺ, here we're basically looking at the ayah in where it tells him, Bima araka Allah, with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, in order to recognize that this is not necessarily to see it as Bima araka Allah, not necessarily to see it as an actual sight of eye, but this is a vision to mean mental vision, to mean heart vision, to mean recognize it. So وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا is basically to tell you in where even when you have the vision and you recognize through the lens of Quran and Sunnah that all the system is basically a system that is founded on disbelief, that is founded on human basis, and or at least their grounds of what makes truth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, don't support it, don't be part of it. And of course, what you need to apply, what you need to embrace is really the rules that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, had basically inspired the Prophet ﷺ with, without taking, and of course without going forth with probably all the narrative and all the representation that they might actually present in where to prove that this is the perfect system, or this is the perfect ruling, etc. So you want to be careful from the narrative, and this is really important because narratives can be very deceiving. And of course, when you're talking about the narratives, you're not finding that yourself, but being in a delusion, because the narratives, they play on emotions. I want you to focus on that one. Narratives play on emotions, and it's really sad to say that a lot of those that I would say that had become an easy target for a lot of the common, let me call it delusional narratives in America specifically, are usually the ones that are very emotional beings. So all this LGBT and all that stuff was really mostly downplayed and mostly adopted and actually taken as an of course, an easy in finding easy targets with those that are one, children, women, and those with certain disabilities like autism, and those certain disabilities basically makes people more vulnerable. When they find, and here's the game, they're doing exactly the game that was actually played by different colonizers or different groups in order to bring about the perpetration for their or colonization, their own ideas. What they wanted to do was target the second generation, target the younger generation, because to them, they're not aiming at now, because they know their delusion cannot whatsoever be adopted by the older generation that is my age and within our age group, because you cannot make us be fooled to actually see the reality. And we know the reality because you cannot actually change nature by creating a narrative. So who do they use? Who do they manipulate? The younger generation. Why? Because to them, by manipulating the younger generation, which is the generation that is not capable of identifying truth and is most vulnerable and most emotional, narrative is all about playing with emotions. Narrative is all about not using common sense, but using the play of words. That's how the game is played. Why? The younger generation, because they're not aiming now, they're aiming 20 years from now. When these children become adults, they're looking at the goal of actually having a future where they'll be the ones in authority. It's these younger generations that will be the adults, that will be in power, that they're aiming at, because they know they cannot mess with mine and your brain, those, because we're adults and we're recognizing the manipulation and we're recognizing what a fact is. They will be capable of deluding your children. And that's really dangerous. And similarly, with those that are more vulnerable, those with disabilities, autism, and of course, other disabilities, they will work on bringing in an emotion. We're there. We understand your disability. We understand your powers. We understand no one embraces you. We understand this, and they'll play on them like they're the ones that are going to embrace them. They're the ones that are going to love them. They're the ones that will be there as their friends because they are understanding what they're going through. But what they're really working on is expanding their numbers and expanding the areas, whether it's the children or those that are vulnerable, in order to expand more and more people, even if it was the children and the vulnerable, in order to let such an idea perpetuate within the society, again in an emotional way. What does that mean in an emotional way? In order to bring about some form of, again, a narrative in where it's to seek pity, but their pity would not actually last long, because what they want to do is make sure that they are the ones in power. The second that you disagree, you will be finding yourself on the brink of losing your job, on the brink of actually losing probably your home, etc. In other words, the claim of care is nothing but a lie. It is nothing but a lie until they get in power. So the reason why I wanted to say that was وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا is really because when you see people embracing wronghood, embracing, of course, other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, you're seeing people that are betraying themselves, betraying truth, and willing to do whatever it takes, a lie, a commitment to the lie, and even betray you in order to believe the lie. When you look at the word lil kha'inin, what is il kha'in? Il kha'in certainly means a person that betrays, or the betray, those that are betraying, basically. All right. But why is it actually saying lil kha'inin? Because the second that you go against the Quran and the Sunnah, you had then betrayed yourself by thinking that such a delusion is basically the truth. You had betrayed yourself, betrayed the society, and certainly you had lived in a delusion thinking that that is the truth, when in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually given you bima arak Allah, had given you the realities and the true definition of what truth is, true definition of what justice is, and certainly what the application should look like. The second you go against the Quran and Sunnah, you're going against your own interest. You're going against your own interest, the society's interest, and therefore you're basically becoming a kha'in. You're betraying yourself, betraying the society, and certainly living in a delusion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't be a khasim. Here, il-khasim is basically the advocator, the person that would basically be in support of another one. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling him, don't support these people. Don't support those that would go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't support them when they go against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ruled, which is really similar to the ayah, ها أنتم هؤلاء جاللتم عنهم في الحياة الدنيا. Who's going to defend them? The word جادلتم is really to argue, to defend. And certainly, when you're speaking about any idea, you're going to bring about in sparse. Some people are just really good in going in, arguing, and trying to prove points. Debaters, real good debaters. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us right there that beware of how you support and who you and the ideas that you would defend, and certainly the people that you are trying to defend. You have to be careful on what ideas you adopt, what ideas you defend, and certainly how you create and put in the foundations of how you see the world in truth. You apply the truth, you defend justice, you stand up for justice, and you use the tools to define justice in the right way. Now, of course, Ibn Atiyah had actually explained the question, the answer to the question. Does that mean that the Prophet ﷺ committed a sin or not? So the Prophet ﷺ did not commit a sin because the Prophet ﷺ right away was corrected by the wahi, the wahi, sorry. The Prophet ﷺ did in the beginning actually defend defend Bishr, Mubashir, and Bushair in the beginning, that he doesn't have, that is basically Qatada and Rifa'a, that they don't have the right to bring about an accusation without having any evidence. Now, it's important to mention that the Prophet ﷺ had actually mentioned in the hadith that I am a human. I would rule and judge based on what I hear. So if I had ruled something in your favor and you know that it's basically not it's supposed to be in your favor, but it is for your Muslim brother, then you should give it back to them, because in that situation, I had just basically giving you a portion of hellfire and not necessarily an advantage. So you cannot use the Prophet's words as the evidence in this situation when you know that you don't have the right to basically take somebody else's right, even if the words of the Prophet. So, and this is something very often that I would get in where a woman, for example, would call me and say, my husband did this and this, and went in so much detail of how her husband was just the most evil person on earth, etc. And then you, in the beginning, I was actually, I would say, fooled by all the amount of emotions that were put in the words, and I was fast to judge and support the women in their words, because probably the amount of emotions that were actually put in her advocating herself and how she was abused and all of that. But later on, I realized that a lot of those emotions were really nothing but crocodile tears, that many have the capacity to betray themselves and, in fact, live a lie, literally live a lie, create a lie, live it like it's the truth, and they will cry. And once you hear the other side, you discover that the story was totally not related to what it was presented as. You discover that the whole story was totally different. And that person that came to you crying and presenting it like it's the end of the world and that they're actually abused and all of that, certainly it could be true and I could be wrong. But with many cases coming forward, I would like to say to the women, especially that you don't always have access to listen to the men. This is not me here defending the men or against women or even the other way around. Not at all. But this is to say, don't be a person that judges based on your emotions or based on the amount of emotions that you see. Learn how to be a person that hears both sides, or at least the person to not be fast in judging. Don't be fast in judging. Take your time. It actually takes a lot of, let me say, what is the word that I could use, but I don't know what word to use, but it takes a lot of getting maybe desanitized. I don't know. I don't know what to use, but unfortunately, many times you just have to take away the emotions, even if the person in front of you is actually in full emotions, and you just have to learn, if you need to judge, don't be fast in using the emotions. You have to go back and use the evidence to make sure that this person is really, even if you don't want to judge because you're not a judge, but even if
Like
you
put your
actually
judge
want
hat
to,
on, basically.
exactly, I would just say, even if you want to give an advice, be careful. Be careful from using the method, the feminist method. The feminist method, they will bring about, let's say, a rare case of an assault, and they'll basically make it like it is the standard case. Women are being, their future is ruined because they're not granted the right to abortion. It's all of that, and it becomes, they'll bring you this weird, strange case of a woman raped and a woman assaulted by, who knows who, and then she basically wanted to bring about a future and she couldn't work and she couldn't this, and at the end she just needed an abortion because that was the only way for her to get a job and be able to overcome basically this person that assaulted her, and her to be this person that is strong and all of that stuff. Basically, they'll bring you this weird and very weird case and present it in such an emotional way that it becomes as if it is the standard. Are all women actually going through this? And let's just assume that indeed that that woman was actually assaulted and this was this weird case. And basically this woman, we needed to defend her. Why do we need to defend her by basically killing a baby? Why can't we have emotions with another vulnerable, which is the baby, who's got no one to advocate for them? The way that they actually do an abortion, they would literally just chop up the baby inside the woman's womb. So
Ya
in order
Allah.
for,
Ya Allah.
wallahi, this is what they do. This is real. They would, start literally chopping up the baby and cutting and literally tearing the baby parts until the baby is finally, of course, their brain is crushed and brought out. This is the, and then they want to support this. And subhanAllah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, وَلَا تَكُنْ لِلْخَائِنِينَ خَصِيمًا. Not because somebody comes out with a certain narrative, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to support it. You need to use the tools of judging, the tools of Quran and Sunnah, and you need to use the tools to get the person back on justice and not necessarily support a claim because it somehow has some emotions in it. Certainly, Bani Ubayriq didn't actually come with a certain emotion, but they actually wanted to say, well, there was no evidence. In other words, they didn't necessarily say, but again, Urwa or Usaid ibn Urwa, he did actually come. There are people of good reputation. There are people of good of a good family. How dare they accuse them of such a crime? And the Prophet ﷺ fell for it. If the Prophet ﷺ can fall for such a thing, believe it or not, I've actually joined in and went into many cases in court, and you will be so surprised. You would be sitting in court, and the amount of emotions that are actually put in there. And of course, where yes, the lawyer would ask these questions in order to basically bring about a case to support that person, or even to prove the other person as being the perpetrator. And there's a lot of questioning that is really directed at how did you feel? What happened? So tell me exactly what happened. Then what? And the lawyers would instruct their clients what to answer, what to say. They would literally practice and do a rehearsal on what questions to ask, what questions they're going to be asked, how to answer, how to limit, and literally ask them to memorize the actual answers. So what this really brings in, and the lawyer will tell you, yeah, I want you here, put a lot of emotions. I want you to do this. They basically are playing the game. This was seen in front of me. This was not someone told me. This was I was actually doing a lot of work, um for women, and joining along with those law firms, and joining along with lawyers, and going to the different courts and seeing what is really happening behind the scenes. And you would be so surprised. Yes, they actually do that. They'll tell you to memorize
Just like
this.
the movies or
It's
back in the day. Yeah, I mean, back in the
exactly
day.
back in the day, exactly, back in the day. But this is real. This is actually real. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just because the rule, or let's say the court, or even of course maybe the government, for example, gives you half your husband's money, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right to take it. But he committed this, but he did this to me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, you go back to Quran and Sunnah to define what is your right and what is his right, and not go back to your judgment and what you think is a fair compensation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that judges what a fair compensation is. But he did this to me, he did that to me. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judges what a fair compensation is. Is it necessarily that I can give you all your rights? I can't necessarily give you all your rights, but that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there. But you also, not because you were assaulted, it doesn't mean you become the victim and also the judge to rule on what a fair compensation should look like. You don't have the right to do that. So how can I actually get my rights? Well, it's a case by case, and we'll look into case by case, but not because the government might give you a certain amount of money or whatever it is. It doesn't mean, if it is not approved by Quran and Sunnah, it doesn't mean that you have the right to take it. واستغفر الله إن الله كان غفورا رحيما. What is واستغفر الله? واستغفر الله, and ask for maghfirah. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. I want you to look at this in where when you look at واستغفر الله إن الله كان غفورا رحيما, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness, for the Lord Almighty is all forgiving, all merciful. So what does that even mean? Istighfar is a form of tasbih. Okay, so when you say do istighfar, was this really an order to the Prophet ﷺ? Yes, certainly. Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell the Prophet ﷺ, Ya ayyuhan nabiyyu taqillah. Straightforward. O Prophet of Allah, have taqwa. If you were in doubt of something, hey, I want you to do this. Or وَلَا تُجَادِلْ الَّذِينَ يَخْتَانُونَ أَنفُسَهُم. Don't defend those that would basically betray themselves. Or even telling him, وَاسْتَغْفِرِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. So this basically was directed at the Prophet ﷺ, in where it was ordering the Prophet ﷺ to do istighfar. Does that mean that only the Prophet ﷺ is supposed to do istighfar? No. It basically means that we adopt the same exact thing unless there is a particularization that only the Prophet ﷺ is referred to in such an ayah. That's the only time that we would say there is a particularization, and this is called the khususiyya. Khususiyya to the Prophet ﷺ, where it is just for the Prophet ﷺ. Is there a khususiyya here? Is there a particularization for the Prophet ﷺ? Here, the answer is no. Why? Because wastaghfirillah, we know that other ayat tell us that we have to seek forgiveness. So this al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bi khusus al-sabab, because the Prophet ﷺ was also ordering us to make istighfar. So therefore, we would replicate and imitate the Prophet ﷺ in where how he was doing the tasbih, how he was doing the istighfar, how he was doing the dhikr, in order to wipe away the ramifications and certainly the implication of sin. Implication of sin. There are two types of sins. We're going to talk about them later on. All right. Two types of sins. A type of sin that is basically a transgression on a certain ruling, not necessarily have a ramification or a result on you. All right. Other sins, they do have an effect and an impact on you without you recognizing. We're going to get there, inshallah. So let's continue. وَلَا تُجَادِلْ عَنِ الَّذِينَ يَخْتَانُونَ أَنفُسَهُم. And don't defend those that would basically betray themselves. They're betraying themselves. How can a person betray themselves? Just by going against justice, just by going against truth. That would actually mean they're betraying themselves by creating either a narrative or creating a lie. And basically, in that situation, they would be the ones to actually bring it to themselves in where in Allah la yuhibbu man kana khawanan athiba. For the Lord Almighty, the word la yuhib, the Lord Almighty dislikes. What does that mean? The Lord Almighty dislikes. Does he like to? If he dislikes, does that mean he likes? Certainly. We would know that there's certain ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala likes certain things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes certain things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gets angry on things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is happy about certain things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is detesting certain things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is angry at certain things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is happy or rida or content over certain things or pleased over certain things. So what does that mean? Is that a form of anthropomorphization? All right, what is this word again? Anthropomorphization. And that means anthropomorphization is when you would give the Lord or God human attributes or human traits. So we would consider that such traits are not to commit anthropomorphization or regard that God is like human, but this is basically to leave such descriptions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned about himself as is. So when we speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that yadullahi fawqa aydihim, that the Lord Almighty's Allah Almighty's hand is beyond their hand. Sorry about that. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand is beyond their hand, etc. So we just leave it as it is without falling in any form of what is called tajseem. What is tajseem? Tajseem basically means you regarded that the Lord Almighty is confined in a space or confined in a place or has a certain human feature. In that situation, what you will find yourself is that you had limited the Lord Almighty. And to limit the Lord Almighty is to limit in his powers or limit in his magnificence. Then you had contradicted yourself in how you would embrace the magnificence and the Almighty. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Shura, a very simple foundation in understanding in understanding how we relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how we relate to the names and attributes. Maybe we can actually find Surah Al-Shura and help you see it. Although we've done it before, but it's important to actually see it again and again to help us recognize these words right there. And let's see, right there, we're going to go to it right now, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gives you the main thing and how to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, let's see that ayah. Here we go. This is the ayah. I want you to look at it. This ayah, you got to memorize it because this is a foundational ayah. فاطر السماوات والأرض جعل لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا ومن الأنعام أزواجا يذرأكم فيه ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير له مقاليد السماوات والأرض يبسط الرزق لمن يشاء ويقدر إنه بكل شيء عليم. A foundational ayah. What does it mean? He is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And the word fatir actually means to create out of nothing. He created from your own selves the plurals, in other words, the duality. The whole, what is that? Binary, the whole binary of duality of things from the different cattles, and where the binary male, female, you find it in humans, you find it in animals. يَذْرَأُكُمْ فِيهِ, he created you basically in where you would multiply through the system of reproduction. Different systems of reproduction, one through the egg, one through basically birth, mammals, etc. At the end of the day, you've got a system in where how you reproduce. ليس كمثله شيء. But the Lord Almighty does not fall within the binary system, does not fall within the male-female system. In other words, the system that you would see created in nature, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a creature, but a creator. He created the system. Therefore, be careful in applying the system on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and thinking that the system goes in that way. Therefore, it should be applied on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you? لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's nothing to be compared with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is beyond the system. He is beyond place, samawati wal ard. He's beyond the space of whether in the samawat, in the skies, or earth. He's beyond place. And at the same time, don't think if we say beyond space and beyond place and beyond creation that he doesn't have any feature or does not have any particular descriptions, but the ayah is affirming he is as-Sami' al-Basir. He is all hearing and all knowing. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is negating to have similar features of different things that he created, or that he does not fall within the system of physics or the system of biology, because the Lord Almighty is not to be included within the system. He is outside of the system. The system, biology, whether it's chemistry, physics, whatever it is, that's part of the creation. The Lord Almighty is beyond it. وهو السميع البصير. At the same time, don't negate that ليس كمثله شيء, that there's nothing like unto the Lord Almighty, thinking that the Lord Almighty doesn't exist or he doesn't have certain features. As a matter of fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he's a Sami'a, he's all hearing, he's all seeing, and understand that he controls. In other words, he is the true force behind the rotation, behind basically how everything is functioning on in the galaxies or even on Earth. What does that mean? In where he controls and he actually is the force and the power behind how everything is functioning, not only in the general function, but even in the details, in the detailed function, in where even the rizq, even to keep it alive, even to keep it moving, is basically given and instructed directly by the Lord Almighty, of how much provision, how much life, how much power, how much success, how much failure. All of that is basically instructed directly by the Lord Almighty, and therefore his knowledge, إِنَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. Therefore, the knowledge of the Lord Almighty is beyond all. Now, this is in order to understand when we actually say, وَلَا تُجَادِلْ عَنِ الَّذِينَ يَخْتَانُونَ أَنفُسَهُم. You were capable of seeing what I was doing, right? Yes. And where to understand when we speak about in Allah لا يحب من كان خوانا أثيما, that we would look at when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he dislikes, that would actually mean that the person that falls within the category of being disliked by the Lord Almighty, then in that situation they had been put within the category where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not be the one to give them his direct preservation, his direct care, his direct mercy, and therefore these people will be left with their own behavior, bringing in the result of what they had committed. Now, this is extremely important. When you look at khawan athima, what does it mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes al-khawan al-athim? What is al-khawan? Al-khawan is a person that betrays, or at least a person that is consistent with betraying. What is a betray? A betray is basically a form of lying. It's a form of lying in action. It's a form of lying in making a narrative in order to flip the truth and make it false, or flip falsehood and make it the truth. There is nothing worse than a person of that sort, a person that is al-khawan al-athim, because the person that is willing to defend falsehood in order to present themselves like the victims and lie about it, that's a person with no principle. Because a person that is willing to lie and give up on their principle just to gain materialistic gains or worldly gains, and somehow be considered like the successful person or the person that gained some amount of victory, and willing to give up on all principles just to gain that, and then eventually present themselves like they are the victims and not the perpetrators. This is by far the ugliest personality. It's what is today presented as the narcissist, ugliest personality. Willing to present themselves as the victims and willing to create a narrative, consistent lies, in crying, in living the lie to present themselves as the victims when they know very well that they're nothing but liars. Ya Allah, do I hate, absolutely hate such personalities. Khawanan athima. Not only would they commit such a lie and present themselves as victims, but that will push them to create and bring about even more assaults to the actual victim. They will create a lie and then go into, in order to defend the lie, they will set multiple lies to make sure that they're never discovered. It becomes an ithm after an ithm, an assault after an assault after an assault, because what they seek, these people are khawanan athima. They're basically traitors, and then that betray, it goes into another cycle of committing assault after assault. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep these people away from us. Ya Allah. So inna Allah la yuhib. Ameen ya Rabbi. Wallahi, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, I cannot handle these people. And they're becoming more than ever before. One of the main reasons is because our parenting system is wrong. We're creating more and more children thinking that they are entitled and that they have the right to get everything. And then whenever they don't get what they want, they would then give themselves the justification to basically live as victims and therefore have the right to fight and assault others because they really lived believing that they are entitled and therefore victims, and therefore they have to defend themselves by assaulting others. The way we parent our children is definitely needing a lot of revision. By constantly just praising them, by constantly giving them everything and doing everything for them is not good parenting. We're creating more narcissists. Definitely not good parenting. They have to learn how to work. They have to learn how to clean over themselves. They have to learn how to be the people that don't necessarily think that they're entitled, but they have to have a commitment, a responsibility to give others. They cannot expect that others must be there just at their service. Inna Allah la yuhib man kana khawana, of course, kha'ina. Al-khawan is a plural and a singular is kha'in. Kha'in is one. Khawan is a person that is consistent with khiyana, a person that is consistent with betray is basically khawan. So a person, khawan, is a person that is consistent with that behavior. So that's why when you look at Lugha Arabiya, that shadda right there can mean a gradual thing and could also mean a consistency of something. In this situation, it is a consistency of committing betray. Okay, so this basically, in where this is the al-khiyana, is basically the adjective for basically khana, is basically the past tense of it. All right. يستخفون من الناس ولا يستخفون من الله. What does that mean? So they were doing what? So لا يستخفون من الناس ولا يستخفون من الله. They would hide from the people and not hide from Allah. Really? So we're supposed to hide from Allah? Is that even possible? We're going to get there. وهو معهم إذ يبيتون ما لا يرضى من القول وكان الله بما يعملون محيطا. I'm going to give the wrong translation. When what I would mean by the wrong translation, the surface translation. Let's see. They would hide from the people and they don't hide from Allah, and He's with them when they had hidden what the Lord Almighty would not be content over with words, and the Lord Almighty, with what they know, is all, or is encompassing everything that they would do. Okay, this is a wrong translation. I'm going to go in detail and explain it. All right, let's go in detail with that one. So let's look at this one. So يستخفون من الناس, here's the ayat right there. Basically, that was, remember when the Bani Ubayriq, the Bashir, Bushair, and Mubashir, when they had hid, whether it's the goods, whether it's the shield goods, whatever, that they had actually stolen. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically here exposing them, that they basically thought, well, let's hide it from the people so that we won't be exposed, basically. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling, well, you would basically hide that from the people, but did you actually think that you can hide it away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So this is وَلَا يَسْتَخْفُونَ مِنَ اللَّهِ. That doesn't mean that, oh, they should have actually hid from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this is impossible. This is impossible to hide from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is to actually give a form of rebuke, in where to tell them, well, you know that you cannot hide from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you know that He is Hafiz, that He's basically recording all of that behavior. There's no way that you can hide from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ إِذْ يُبَيِّتُونَ مَا لَا يَرْضَى مِنَ الْقَوْلِ. Now, وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, I want you to focus on this one. When you look at وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, does that mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with them? There are two types. المعية. What is المعية? When I say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you, there is وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ as a comprehensive word, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is witnessing all that they are doing and all that they are preserving or hiding or whatever it is. And there is a more particular one, in where we would say Allah ma'ak, or Allah hafiz, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saving you or protecting you, etc. So there is, to give a comprehensive meaning, وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, to mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching all they're doing. And there is a more specific one to mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala مَعَهُمْ, to mean He's guarding them. Okay? So in this situation, وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ would actually mean the comprehensive one, not that He's preserving them, but that He is raqib, Hafidun alayhim. He's recording all that they're doing. Why? Because the context is rebuking them. The context is basically saying, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is right there telling us they were hiding what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not be content of. The words that they were concealing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not happy about. So what does
Can I
that
ask
mean?
you something? Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wondered if you could use the cursor.
Am I not using the cursor? Oh, it is, Noura. It's right there.
Oh, it's tiny.
It's really tiny.
I was looking for an arrow. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, so that's all right. So here's إِذْ يُبَيِّتُونَ. Oh, I'll do the highlighter. Maybe that's easier. All right. إِذْ يُبَيِّتُونَ basically means to hide. The word bait, what does bait mean? Room, right? Or house. So here, yubayitun actually comes from the same root, bait, but here, yubayitun as a verb actually means to house or to hide, and of course, to conceal something. ما لا يرضى, what the Lord Almighty would not be content over. From what? from the words. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you look at وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, there are two types of مَعَهُمْ. The first, ma'ahum, is to mean that he is encompassing and he is raqib hafidun alayhim. He's watching them. He's basically tracking everything that they're doing. And there's also the part in where the Lord Almighty would be raqib or ma'a, to mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preserving. So we would know based on this word that since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not content over them, then therefore وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ is to basically mean he's watching them. All right. And certainly not contradicting the words, because you might say, well, wait a minute. I thought Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only give preservation to those that are basically deserving the love. Remember when we look at Inna Allah yuhibbu la yuhibbu. So if the Lord Almighty does not love the person that is khawan, then why is he saying he is with them? This is not an oxymoron. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not like a person that betrays, but this is a comprehensive ma'ahum, to mean he's with them, meaning recording all that they're doing. Okay, so I hope I'm using the words and explaining that one. Let's see.
Yeah,
And
that's
of
very
course,
clear. Jazakallah khair.
yeah, alhamdulillah. يستخفون من الناس. And of course, certainly they thought that they could just hide from the people, but there's no way that they can hide from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ها أنتم هؤلاء جادلتم عنهم في الحياة الدنيا فمن يجادل الله عنهم. Now, I want you to look at the word يجادل الله. يجادل الله. Why did I say يجادل الله, not يجادل الله? So the way, the general rule, when you have the word Allah, you're going to look at the letter that is right before it. The letter that's right before it. If it is a dhamma, an u, or an a, that means the word Allah would be Allah with tafkhim, strong, Allah. But if the letter before the word Allah, that is this letter, if it had a kasra, which is I, and not a dhamma, then it would be yujadilillah, la. And let's say it was an u, yujadili lahu. If it had a kasra in the last letter coming before the word Allah. This is just a fast thing. That's why we would say Bismillah, not Bismillah. Bismi, mi, because the word Bismillah, the letter mi, is the letter that became before the word Allah. So that's why we would say Bismillah. All right, let's continue. فَمَنْ يُجَادِلُ اللَّهَ عَنْهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَمَّنْ يَكُونُ عَلَيْهِمْ وَكِيلًا. Then who's the one that is the word yujadil basically means to argue, to defend, to advocate. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, you defended them in this life, in hayat dunya, in this life. Then who's the one that's going to defend them in the hereafter on day of judgment? Or who's the one that is going to be wakila? Il-wakil is, well, number one, il-wakil is the person or the caretaker or the one that basically guides them and guards them. In other words, it's more like of a power of attorney. All right. So in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us that you cannot manipulate and change truth just by defending anybody and just by them being presented as the perpetrators. The truth of the matter is that it does not change the reality. Since it doesn't change the reality, you might actually gain some kind of maybe some kind of a privilege in this dunya, but on judgment day, that's where the true judgment really matters. Who's going to defend them on judgment day? أما يكون عليهم وكيلا, or who's going to be there to actually be the caretaker for them. What does that mean? So what that means is that when you actually make a decision, when you are in a situation where you might actually consider yourself that you won a case, but the truth of the matter, not only was it a loss, but it will actually come back onto you, and it will bring about a result of what you had betrayed. What does that even mean? Every single wronghood that you will commit, even if all the people supported you for it, it will actually have wabal. It will have an implication on you without you realizing. It will bring about an outcome on you. There is no way that you can hide and run away from how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will retaliate, whether sooner or later. So when you actually abide by the truth, you abide by justice, what you bring, certainly you might have lost a certain dunya privilege by probably not winning a case and getting a privilege, but what you had won is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the one to give you support. But I lost the case. I didn't get the privilege. Remember, the true privilege is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is wakil. What is al-wakil? Al-wakil is a power of attorney. Al-wakil could also be the supporter. Al-wakil is the one that takes care of your matters. So when you recognize that by abiding by justice, even though it doesn't give you a dunya privilege, one privilege you're getting is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of your matters. That's all that matters. Even if it may seem that, am I going to actually literally say, and I've seen this when working with lawyers, they would literally tell their clients, don't say this, you'll lose the case. And I'd seen some people with taqwa, they'll say, but I have to say it because it's the truth. And she said, no, you'll lose the case. Right now, our goal is to win the case. It doesn't matter how and what happened. You have to win the case. Do you want to this and this to happen to you? There's the shaitan speaking. The shaitan speaking, exactly.
SubhanAllah, SubhanAllah.
Wallahi, that's what the lawyer will say. Do you want to lose the case? This is what happened. Remember what? Because the lawyer just wants to win the case. So I want you to look at وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ. And when you look at وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, of course, you did actually have certain groups that basically said وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course, this is actually dangerous to say. To actually say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere would actually mean that he's basically in every single thing. And that's the foundation of paganism. The pagan idea really is considering that Allah is part of everything, and therefore his spirit, a divine nature, becomes part of everything that surrounds you, and therefore it becomes part of God. And therefore we can worship it because it resembles the power of God. And that's the same thing, even in Christianity, that Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, that he basically resembled Ruhullah, the soul and the spirit of God, and therefore he became God. Therefore, he was not only the Son of God, but he was God himself. And then later, of course, go into, well, what does Trinity really mean? And then they'll go into all these details. That's the same thing with Hinduism, regarded that the cow basically gives life and basically has a spirit of God. Therefore, we should embrace the cow as basically what is part of a spirit of God. And therefore, it becomes God itself. We should treat it like it's God itself. And that whole idea of paganism really comes from that. So, how do we interpret it then in order to not understand it that huwa ma'ahum, that he's part of God? And that's basically what a lot of the ideas of Sufism also embrace, in where when you look at al-Hallaj or you look at Ibn Arabi, they basically embrace that idea, in where he says that al-Hallaj or even Ibn Arabi, that he basically became or having the spirit of God, and where they went as far in al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah in his book Ibn Arabi, in where he said that Fir'aun himself, that second when he was drowning, that he basically had embraced God himself at that time, and that he had a divine nature at that time. So just look at that. That's kufr on the spot. And of
Oh,
course,
having shaitan routine.
exactly. And of course, those that want to defend this idea would say, well, no, you understood it literally, and this is not to be understood literally. So some Sufis will actually say, no, you misunderstood it. This is a metaphorical thing, etc. But then, and yesterday I was actually reading the poetry for Rumi, and although maybe remember his poetry was actually written in Persian and in Turkish and some in Arabic. Certainly, the Arabic poetry is not the best, at least for translation for Rumi. I yet would really want to find that, but Rumi, right now, you would see there is a lot of, what is the word that I could use? That is an agenda to advance or at least present Rumi's ideas in his poetry. Let me give you an idea of a Rumi.
I mean,
Rumi,
some of it is just plain out shirk, right?
well, let me explain a couple things. So Rumi, he was a Sufi scholar who was actually born in Balkh, or it was actually originally from Balkh, Afghanistan. And we did actually talk about Balkh, Afghanistan. Balkh, Afghanistan actually had a lot of scholars that actually came from Balkh. So it seems like these people are genetically smart. From the Midlahak, for a lot of scholars actually came from Balkh. And a lot of scholars came from Afghanistan. All right. Maybe genetically smart, you need to see that. But anyhow, and he was definitely extremely smart. When you look at his poetry was considered as ilahiyat and al-ishq and all of that, in where is deep love for the Lord Almighty, deep spirituality. But the deep spirituality sometimes goes out of, let's say, the logical spirituality, or let me say the spirituality that is founded on I guess, knowing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set for you to understand, and then goes into some form of mystical spirituality. And of course, when you say mystical, you're going to find yourself adopting a lot of metaphorical and figurative words that can be misunderstood by many as a literal wording. And if you take the literal wording of it, it would be plain shirk and kufr right on the spot. So, of course, those that want to defend Rumi will say, well, you cannot understand it literally, but you have to basically understand it in a figurative way. And of course, it becomes really hard to judge if a person every single time they're going to twist and say, well, no, this one was a metaphor. No, this one was literal. And then you would then decide which one and when you want to use the literal and when you want to use the metaphorical. And then it becomes this word of play. So that becomes a dangerous thing. But one thing we do know is that he did introduce music as a way of making dhikr. So that Mawlawiya tariqa and, the people, the darvish that would go into these circles, they would wear these long skirts and start turning and turning for hours. So those
Yeah, like
would
those
be
Turkish people.
like those Turkish people. They would turn around and for hours and say that they would connect with the divine by going into, I don't know, some form of dizziness. Just by thinking about them circling, I just got dizzy right now. Seriously, uqsam billah, I just got dizzy right now just thinking about the turning around and all of that. But anyhow, so I just want you to keep in mind. So how do we understand wa huwa ma'hum without adopting? Oh man, I really got dizzy. Oh boy. Um, how do we actually not adopt an interpretation to mean that the Lord is connected, at least physically, or that He's part of everything? And how do we actually relate to it? We relate to it as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't whatsoever limit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to a certain body, and certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laysa kamithlihi shay. We would just leave it at that and just consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically beyond the creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all, and therefore we'll just leave what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described as this is what it is, and we'll just leave it at that without giving a metaphorical interpretation and without giving a limitation and say, well, this is what it looks like. This is all of that. We don't really know. So we just leave it as this is part of al-ghaib when it comes to understanding the features, or at least Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we just leave it at that. ما يكون من نجوى ثلاثة إلا هو رابعهم. Every single, of course, conversation or even najwa. And najwa is basically any personal or private conversation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ما يكون من نجوى ثلاثة إلا هو رابعهم, in another surah, in Surah al-Mujadila. All right, and where He Himself, yes, every single conversation He would be with them. So again, with the word with them, but this is not necessarily to mean with them that He is aiding or He is supporting all of this, but this is basically to tell you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching all of this. So where were we? وَكَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا يَعْمَلُونَ مُحِيطًا, and that is, let's look at it right there, and that is in order to say وَكَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا يَعْمَلُونَ مُحِيطًا, in order to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encompassing everything that they are doing. So when we say وَهُوَ مَعَهُمْ, in where He encompasses, He is in basically in watching all of this, and basically looking at all and recording all of what is happening. All right, so this is بما يعملون محيطا. So we'll end right here. I could see it's 1:54, and I just thinking about the dervish, I actually got dizzy just by looking at them. I didn't even practice their spirit. Wallahi al-azim, I got dizzy. I feel the whole world is actually going in circles right now.
Try to focus on one point.
I'm trying, but I'm seeing the laptop. I'm seeing everything moving right now. The whole room is moving. Man, just I didn't even think about them. All right, maybe I gotta, inshallah, I'll stop right here, inshallah, before I get dizzy and let you all get dizzy with me. Yeah, get you all dizzy. So inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. Inshallah, Rabbi yahfadkum jami'an. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.